Ah, Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. Today you catch me at a funny time. I have just returned from the blood bank in Penrith, just west of Sydney in New South Wales, where I live. And I go to the blood bank every fortnight to donate my plasma. My group is AB positive, that is my blood type. So I have a fairly rare blood. I can only donate whole blood to about 2% of the population. So there's very little need for my whole blood by the blood bank. The blood bank doesn't really need my whole blood, but because I am AB positive, I am the universal plasma donor, and plasma is the new whiz thing in modern medicine. There's more than 18 really important life-saving medicines, new medicines, to do with cancer and brain diseases and all sorts of things that are built on plasma. And also plasma are used in the emergency, in the casualty ward, for people coming in suffering major trauma or burns. And of course during surgery again from trauma. So plasma is used in a lot of different treatments in a lot of different ways, and there's a huge demand for plasma. And being AB positive, I am the universal plasma donor. Everybody can have my plasma, and it makes me feel $1 million. I just love going to the blood bank every fortnight and donating my plasma. And about 2 months ago I made my 100th donation, and they gave me this wonderful plaque that you can see with the certificate and the little badges to mark my journey to 100, and a photograph here of me in the chair hooked up to the machine as I'm donating the plasma, as I'm going through that hour-long process, because it takes quite a long time. When I donate 824 mils of plasma, and what they do is they pull out a whole heap of blood from your system. Actually, they pull it out at about a cup at a time, and it goes into a really fancy centrifuge machine which spins the blood really quickly and separates out the plasma from the rest of the blood. And they keep the plasma, and then the blood comes back to me. So it's that cycle, and that cycle happens around 13 times during a donation, so that they can eventually get their 824 millilitres of plasma. And yeah, it sounds like a lot. It actually is. It leaves a huge bag behind at the end. You can actually, I don't know whether you can see it, but you can see the bag of plasma just down here at the bottom of this machine, where all my plasma is accumulating during this particular donation for my 100th plasma donation. And I don't know whether you can see it, but plasma looks nothing like a blood product. You would actually swear the bag of plasma that I leave behind at the end, almost a litre of it, you would almost swear that it was urine. It is pure gold. And from the medical point of view, of course, it literally is a bag of liquid gold. Plasma is just so important now for so many different medicines, and as I said, the treatment of burns and trauma victims and all sorts of things. So it makes me feel $1 million. And today I have just returned, hence my uniform. Again, that they gave me this when I celebrated my 100th donation. They gave me this shirt to wear. And today I returned from donation 115. So I'm feeling pretty good about myself. So that's it from the plasma donation 100. And you can see I've still got the bandaging here, because as I said, I've only just got home. So at the moment I need to keep this bandaging on for another hour or two before I remove it. That was the site from where the needle went into my arm so they could get the plasma that they needed. Oh, Philippa, you're a quirky, whimsy old man. The blood bank, it really does make me feel brilliant. The point of this video, however, right, this video has a rather almost pretentious title, I guess. The wonderful Ruben from To Readers It May Concern. Ruben has come up with this fantastic tag concept around the idea of maniacal, or the literature of the maniac. the monarchical literature. And he's invited people to participate and to join in the fun and trying to explore literature that we think could be associated with the maniac, with the maniacal spirit, if you like. So I have called my video A Maniacal Mania. Is it okay not to be okay? I've said many times now on my YouTube channel, I have a diagnosis of PTSD, and I am being treated for PTSD, depression and anxiety, and I'm doing really well now. 5 years ago I was in a really bad place before that dog, that beautiful Billy Blue, came into my life, but I am in a really good place now. I'm being treated for my depression and anxiety, for my PTSD. You know, I see psychiatrists and psychologists and doctors. I have lots of medical intervention. And of course, you know, I put up some protective barriers to help me get through the worst of my depressive episodes. The most immediate, the best thing that I have done is to adopt Billy Blue. He has just come into my life and he has saved my life. That dog is just miraculous. Within 2 weeks of him coming into my life, I was a different person. But of course, you know, you can't put all your eggs into one basket. So my psychologists and psychiatrists have been very keen that I build up around me protective barriers so that I don't have any more suicide attempts. Because they were getting quite bad at the end there about 5 years ago. So I've got my Billy Blue. I've got this tiny home that I've built in my wonderful daughter's backyard. Rhiannon really looks after me and has given me this space in her yard to share so that I can have this tiny home, and I can afford, you know, in this little home to live very simply and very cheaply and to, you know, very efficiently just make a living out of my reading and writing and remove myself from all my old pressures of being, you know, running big, large camping and sport programs for adolescents. Another protective barrier that I put up around me, as well as Billy and my tiny home, removing my, you know, the pressures of work, just retreating to this little tiny home with my career now as a reader and writer. And another thing, of course, is the blood bank. You know, the blood bank is another really important thing. That really does keep me alive, and it keeps my mental health heading in a good direction. So the blood bank is also, like Billy, my tiny home, my change of job, you know, these are things which are really important for keeping me on a much more even keel. The blood bank is really important. But before all these things started going really well for me, as I said, I was in a really bad place. 10 years ago, I was living in Melbourne. I had a really bad suicide attempt in late 2014, which resulted in me spending a few days in a Darwin hospital before being transferred to a psychiatric ward. And I spent almost a month in the Darwin psychiatric hospital before I could be discharged. And that resulted in the end of my career. So since late 2014, I have not worked in my traditional employment as running these big camping and sport programs, Duke of Edinburgh, all sorts of things like that. Now I just work at home as a reader and writer. But as a result of losing my normal employment, I retreated from the Northern Territory, where I was working in very remote First Australian people running sport and camp programs for their kids. And I retreated to the city of Melbourne. And I was very lucky. I loved Melbourne to bits. I bought a little townhouse just west of Melbourne in a beautiful suburb called Sunshine. It was literally just 15 kilometres from the middle of Melbourne. And there was a train, you know, we live very close to the rail line. And there was a train every 10 or 15 minutes into the city. So, you know, it was a time when I didn't have Billy. I was very mobile. I was working already from home as a reader and writer, so I had time. I was trying to recover my mental health and strength. So I was very mobile. I didn't have the dog. and I could get on a train and just go into the city and explore the Melbourne cricket ground because I fell in love with Australian football. One of the things that I really fell in love with Melbourne was this little club, this little working class club in the western suburbs of Melbourne at Footscray, just west of Melbourne. And it went right out to Sunshine where my townhouse was located. This little club, the Western Bulldogs, it was based in Footscray, and I just fell in love with the doggies. I was really, really lucky. In 2016, I'd become a member of the club, and I was going to all their home games and cheering on the doggies. I just loved them to bits, and I just fell in love with Australian football madly. And in 2016, this beautiful club it's been going for more than 100 years, and they've won the competition twice. And the second time they won the competition was in 2016 when I was a member and I was living in Melbourne. So in 2016 I found myself at the Melbourne cricket ground with 100,000 mad raving supporters cheering on the Western Bulldogs as we took on the might of the Sydney Swans. And we won that grand final, that match, 89 points to 67. Oh boy, one of the best days of my life. Oh my goodness, I just couldn't believe, I'd only been a member of the club for 2 years. That was the first time I'd ever lived in Melbourne. I joined this club, fell madly in love with them, just really took everything up on board because I am, an all or nothing type person. And I couldn't believe it. Within 2 years, I was at the Melbourne cricket ground cheering on my club as it won its second premiership. It's been competing for more than 100 years and it's won twice. And I was there for the last time. Oh, wicked. Anyway, yes, this is the old-fashioned, the woolen Guernsey that the Footscray Bulldogs used to wear before World War II, before World War I even, before they started making their Guernseys out of more modern materials. But this is one of the original Guernsey of the Western Bulldogs that they played Australian football in. Oh, I just fell in love with it. Oh my goodness. The Western Bulldogs. Oh. But, of course, when I got on that train from Sunshine to head into Melbourne, I didn't always go to the cricket or to the footy. I did often go to art galleries or to the Melbourne Symphony, the Melbourne Opera, and, of course, Melbourne Museum. And while I was there, Melbourne Museum got this absolute coup. They convinced some of the great Northern European museums to lend them a lot of archaeological finds from that great Norse, the great Viking, the period of the Vikings. And so in 2016 or 2017, I think it was 2017, Melbourne Museum hosted this major exhibition called We Call Them Vikings. And this is the catalogue that went with this exhibition. And I just couldn't wait to get there. I've always been mad for history and archaeology. I love, particularly anything to do with Anglo-Saxon, Celtic and Viking Britain and, Northern Europe. So I just couldn't wait to get to this exhibition. And of course, as soon as I got there the first time, I bought a season ticket and I was in and out of this exhibition 3 or 4 times every week for the couple of months while it was there in Melbourne. And I just had an absolute ball. And this catalogue is absolutely beautiful. And this catalogue is really interesting. The catalogue and the point of the exhibition was to try and get people to see the Vikings differently. We always see the Vikings as these mad marauders who are constantly, raping, pillaging and plundering. They were just violent after violent after violence. This exhibition and this catalogue is getting us to take another look at the Vikings and to actually see that most of the Vikings who came out of Northern Europe and settled in places like, for example, Britain, because the Vikings, of course, owned the whole of the north of the United Kingdom from York north. It was all part of what used to be called the Danelaw for a period of 100 or 200 years. That whole section, all of Scotland and most of northern England was actually part of the Viking territory and part of the Danelaw. And York, of course, was their great capital. I've always dreamed of one day getting to the United Kingdom and, of course, getting to York and exploring Viking or Norse York. Oh, it'd be one of the great thrills of my life if I can somehow pull it off at some stage. But yes, this exhibition was getting us to see that the Vikings, most of them were not pirates. Most of the Viking immigrants were simply small farmers, small settlers, and they didn't move into other territory to conquer it. They didn't move in to simply plunder and pillage. They were simply small farmers home to stay. And they built their longhouses, and they were actually, they were often the subjects of racism and of brutality and attack. In the United Kingdom, for example, there was the famous St. Brice's Day massacre, where we know there were several hundred young Viking men who had settled in England and were working as small farmers. They'd been living in England for 100 years, their families. And all these young men were rounded up and slaughtered and put into a mass grave that has now been discovered. So now we not only have the written record of the St. Brice's Day massacre, but we've also got what we're pretty sure was the actual site of the mass grave, and it's been excavated by British archaeologists now. So most of these young Vikings were actually small farmers, as I said, home to stay. They built their longhouses. They were not building round houses, they were building rectangular houses, and to show again how much fear they often lived in, they built what were called subterranean tunnels from underneath the floor of their houses, and to get outside, another 20 metres along, so that if their house ever came under attack by locals who wanted to herd the Vikings and get rid of them, they could escape by getting into these souterrains, these underground tunnels underneath the floor of their houses, and then they'd be dug under the ground for 20 metres or so they could then hopefully make their escape and get away. So going to this exhibition, of course, I was able to just reacquaint myself with Norse mythology, all the great Norse sagas. I've always loved the William Morris, that grand utopian communist thinker from Victorian England. I've just always been madly in love with William Morris. William Morris, of course, fell in love with the North, and he actually made several trips to Iceland, and he went on horseback and camping out rough all around Iceland. He did that 4 or 5 times, and he wrote lots of, he translated lots of Norse sagas into English. He was one of the first people to translate the Norse sagas into the English language. He did them as both prose translations and poetry translations. Really interesting bloke. And he also, of course, wrote great diaries recounting his adventures on horseback and sleeping out rough in Iceland during these 4 or 5 exhibitions that he went on. And I've always just loved that. And then, of course, William Morris inspired this whole, the whole English love affair with the opera of Wagner, particularly, of course, the Ring Cycle. And William Morris then also inspired other poets like W.H. Auden. Auden himself was inspired by William Morris to go to Iceland, to travel to Iceland, to camp, to sleep rough, to go on horseback and explore Iceland, and then write about it in diaries and journals and what have you. And then, of course, like William Morris, W.H. Auden also translated some of the Norse sagas and retold them in long poems that you can buy from him, of course, now. And they're fantastic stuff. I know W.H. Auden was a complicated man, and there are some people who have a very difficult time approaching his poetry because he was a complicated person. But for me, I think I have to separate the man from the writing, and I love the poetry. And in particular, I love W.H. Auden's longer poems, in particular these longer poems that are dealing with the ancient Norse material. So this was just a fantastic exhibition, really mind-blowing. It did have axes, it did have the great Osborg ship, the great archaeological, the skeleton of this ship. And it did have axes. It didn't shy away from the fact that the Vikings were also warriors, very feared warriors. And, they did do a lot of marauding all over Europe. And so the exhibition didn't shy away from that. There were axes in the exhibition. But of course the exhibition also really prioritised focused our attention on archaeological objects to do with farming, to do with commerce, to do with beautiful ornamental ornaments. And there was even this wonderful tradition in the Viking hands of artisans getting the sword, the shields and bits of swords, and redecorating, reusing old swords, redoing them as, for example, bracelets and as ornaments to do on women's clothing and all sorts of things. They were really interesting people, far more interesting than the television series where the Vikings are always simply marauding warriors. They were far more interesting than that. But when I was in this exhibition and going through this all the time, I wrote this book called Cactus, my current book. This is a work of ekphrastic poetry, ekphrastic poetry about the arts. And it's also, of course, a book that is very much about the confessional poetic and exploring my own mental health problems, which at that stage in my life were very, very bad. I did spend a little bit of time in and out of psychiatric care during the 7 years that I was living in Melbourne. So this book is a book of ekphrastic poetry, a book of confessional poetry, and it is also a book of objectivist poetry, in that mode of William Carlos Williams, the great poem of Patterson, which is sort of a riff off James Joyce's Ulysses, isn't it? Sort of a day in the life as one person spends a day simply walking their way through the suburbs of a wonderful city. And so this collection of poetry is also very much an objectivist work. So it sees me getting up in the morning, moving about my little townhouse, going out the front door, walking to Sunshine Station through all the beautiful gardens and suburban front yards. And Sunshine was a suburb that had been taken over by Vietnamese people. And so it was really interesting to see all the old-fashioned, rose gardens, besides all the really exotic plants and things from Vietnam. And it was just a great suburb to live in. A lot of African people, particularly from Sudan, had started to settle in Sunshine as well. There were not actually, I think Anglo-Saxon people in Sunshine were about maybe 10% of the population. At least 90% of the population would have been either Vietnamese or Sudanese, mainly Vietnamese. It was a wonderful, rich suburb. I just loved it to bits. So, the poetry I wrote would see me coming out of my townhouse, walking through this beautiful suburb of Sunshine, getting on the train at Sunshine Station, heading into Flinders Street Station, right in the heart of Melbourne. And then from there, of course, if I was going to the exhibition, if I was going to this exhibition, it would, of course, up to Melbourne Museum, so I could go to, we call them Vikings, this amazing exhibition. And while I was going to all the exhibitions, because I revisited my great archaeological documentary shows that I had on DVD, and I was able to revisit a lot of this stuff. And in particular, there's a United Kingdom show called Time Team, which is a wonderful, dig in 3 days. And one of their digs was on Fetler Island, just off the north coast of Scotland. And it was a Viking site, of course. And there was a boat burial, and there was a couple of these rectangular longhouses that they discovered with the souterrain, these tunnels underneath them to help people to get away if they were ever attacked. So during the time, I was traveling, I went to this exhibition 2 or 3 times every week for the whole 2 months that it was there in Melbourne Museum. And of course it inspired me to write some poetry. One of the poems is called The Sunshine Line. It's actually the opening poem of this collection called Cactus, this collection of objectivist, ekphrastic and confessional poetry. So this is the first poem in this collection. And it brings me back to the title of this video, a maniacal mania. Is it okay not to be okay? Because, I'm not okay. I am doing so much better today. I'm better today than I've been at any time for the last 10 years. I am, my treatment that I'm getting for my PTSD, my depression, anxiety is working. I'm feeling so much better, so much stronger. I'm beginning to get much more resilient and beginning to find my way back to the old Philip, the way I used to be. But I still do, I'm on my medication, and I have to be very careful that I have these protective barriers around me to keep my headspace safe. I do live with the constant threat, I guess, of suicide. It is something which is always there, bubbling along in the back of my head, and I've had my plans for suicide in place for a long time, and I am feeling very strong, resilient, in a much happier place today. But I can't pretend that those thoughts and feelings are not there. And this is a poem that deals with this sort of stuff. And, for me, I can talk about this stuff in the safety of the room, the diagnosis room with my psychologists and psychiatrists and doctors. But another place that I feel safe to talk about this is, of course, my confessional poetry. In my confessional poetry, I do have this place where I feel safe to explore this stuff. And unfortunately, some people put it down very quickly, with the mocker oversharing. And, it is a type of oversharing, I get it. But, is it okay not to be okay? Because, it's not okay for me to exit, but sometimes you also feel, as a sufferer of mental bad health, you do also feel that it's not all right to exit, but it's also not all right, to be honest, to share how you feel. People always ask you, how are you going? But they don't often actually want to stop and hear your answer, not an honest answer anyway. It's difficult, isn't it? Is it okay not to be okay? This is a poem, I guess, that deals with those sorts of things. This is a poem that I've called The Sunshine Line, and it begins with a quote from the Book of Wisdom, from the wonderful Hebrew Bible. The breath in our nostrils is a puff of smoke. Put this out, and our body turns to ashes, and the spirit melts away like idle air. Come then, let us enjoy what good things there are. Let not one flower of springtime pass us by. Before they wither, crown ourselves with roses. Oh, I love the Hebrew Bible, and the Book of Wisdom is just a marvelous thing. What a sentiment that was just expressed, encapsulated in that short quote. I just love that. Oh boy. The breath in our nostrils is a puff of smoke. Put this out, and our body turns to ashes, and the spirit melts away like idle air. Come then, let us enjoy what good things there are. Let not one flower of springtime pass us by. Before they wither, crown ourselves with roses. Oh, I love that. This is my poem, The Sunshine Line, about getting up and going to this wonderful exhibition at Melbourne Museum. We call them Vikings. Anxious and in the way, like all suicide survivors, I lay out my woolly vintage VFL Guernsey, the talisman for getting me out. Bulldog Charlie's red, white and blue Footscray oasis. Amidst all the canneries, railway yards and rubber factories, here scraggers plied their trade in wonder at the centre bounce, and an epic bronze on the basalt plinth is Mr. Football's archetypal torpedoed clearance. In this shadow I ricochet, stooped in fancy, bent over a ball, bobbing from my fingers, swerving at full speed as collision lifts and buckles my body, loosens teeth from a chesty bond jaw. and my breathing again pings with facial tics. So I raise a hand to hide an open mouth, inhaling deeply before the bear-like exhalation escapes. Over coffee, I am scored for Henry Gorecki's Third Symphony, ecstatic lamentation, cradled in folk drone, a melodic missive pressed downwards as lower strings abode without diminuendo, and cleave to this primitive tonality, a soprano's towering expressive charge. This is a canon, sounding genocide. And my anxieties manifest in obsessive cleaning of a toilet, crawling after hairs and fluff in corners, before housework gives way to R.N. Williams' black merino crew beneath my talismanic red, white and blue Guernsey, moleskins, leather belt and boots. After some more made-up care, I am almost set to go, and amble into sunshine and the train to Flinders before a walk up Swanston to Melbourne Museum, and we call them Vikings. I set out along Suffolk and Hampshire roads, where weatherboard cottages are now adorned with dragons, golden Vietnamese welcome, and Buddha's grottos to our Holy Mother. Here front gardens are a crop of corn, pumpkin, pomegranate and lime, amidst succulent cycads and roses, and Ballarat Road congregates late arrivals in mosque and gurdwara, while Sudanese harmony settles between Tenyi Banboyu and Welia Ibek's Ethiopian cafe. I've been prescribed medicine and footy cards to disrupt grog's glumness, but it's sunshine despite the Liberal Party's slurs of gang horror that is the earthly paradise, my lemon balm and chamomile. Last weekend, Western Bulldogs hosted the Ujamaa Festival to rise with hashtag African gangs, drumming, dancing, henna, food stalls and face painting before an evening of fireworks and a Constellations blazing packed crowd for AFLW, and I was up in tears. On the train between Sunshine and Flinders, I stand, guarding anxieties between friends, my club colours, and I smile at the welcome of strangers. Go doggies, giving my rejoinder, woof, woof, woof. Such small things to render a line. I'm on a day out, though paid sick leave has given way to unemployment, so I write for nothing, stumped by the endurance of family, whilst I hunt return as household manager. Last night I watched Time Team's 3 days dig on Fetler Island, a looted boat burial with one surviving trefoil brooch transformed for a goddess, and a longhouse's collapsed mass guarding a blue schist floor, soapstone, loom and fishing net weights, but most precious, a longhouse's buried escape tunnel. These boat people were no fearless pirates, but small, fretful farmers, home to stay. And Neil Oliver fashioned people as a flow apart, where dead bodies hung in branches and flamboyant hairstyles attracted immortal standing. This blizzard of flashing axes driven into the sea by a glacier's irresistible action, so that a new start become grounded in trade, Arctic furs, amber and oils. But in England, the Danelaw broke in Anglo-Saxon xenophobia, and Ethelred the Unready's and Bryce's Day massacre, where a longhouse's souterrain escape was a mass grave. With Wagnerian anticipation, Melburnians queue before a museum's recreated Osberg ship, and there are iron axes, But Aryan eugenics is a desolation of monsters and giants, while glass cabinets hoard weights and measures, grindstones, board games and grave goods are not axes, but a Frankish glass beaker, Irish cross, Indian statuette of Buddha, Coptic ladle and beads of carnelian and rock crystal. While trefoil brooches are gilded silver, reimagining baldric and sword decoration. Before these displays, I falter towards oblivion, remembering I am no longer trusted, home alone with grog and knives. But in truth, I'd never foul my own nest, as self-harm is self-care, well, a leeching anyway. And my suicide is always a walk alone into space, a suppressed escape route with a horde of empties to mark a valetudinarian's ceremonial way, and not a treasure anywhere from my doggies or family to show where I once withered with a crown. Being a suicide survivor is not easy. And yes, thank you, Ruben, for inviting me to take part in this exploration of literature that is maniacal, that is associated with the maniac tradition. For me, in some ways, confessional poetics, I think, is often put down as being oversharing and as being maybe out of control in a way that is very similar to that of the maniac. I think many confessional poets, particularly maybe Sylvia Plath, and in particular, of course, Anne Sexton, but also John Berryman and, Robert Lowell, W.D. Snodgrass. There are so many of these wonderful mid-20th century American poets who really got this confessional poetic off the ground. And they are often put down as being oversharers. It's not okay to exit, and many of them did pass away by suicide. It's not okay to exit, but it's also not okay to share how you feel, to answer honestly that simple question, how are you going? And for me, of course, the confessional poetic is even more difficult now, of course, isn't it? Because, we've been doing confessional poetry now for almost 100 years. And it's very hard to find new things to open up about, to be real about, to be honest about. You can't just keep repeating what Anne Sexton or John Berryman were doing almost 100 years ago. You have to find new things to say, don't you? And new ways of saying it. So the confessional poetic, I think, does have much in common with this literature of the maniac. There's someone who is maybe oversharing, out of control, always in danger of some type of mental health collapse, breakdown, depression, suicide, whatever, self-harming. So this is my literature of the maniacal tradition. Hopefully I've done it in a cheeky, smirking kind of way, because I much prefer whimsy. And as I said, I am doing so much better today. I have so many good things in my life. My adult children, my 2 gorgeous grandchildren, Billy Blue, my fortnightly visits to the blood bank, this wonderful tiny home with my career now as a reader and writer. I have so many things, so many protective barriers and things that I am excited about. And I am doing so well today. I am doing really well today. I feel so much better and stronger. So, welcome to my literature of the maniacal tradition, the confessional poetic, which often walks so closely hand in hand with that of the maniac. And thank you, Ruben, from To Read As It May Concern. Thank you for asking me to get involved in this. It was a great joy, and I love, the bookish connection that I have with you. So thank you so much, Ruben. I really treasure our bookish connection, and I hope it goes on for many years into the future. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. I'm doing so well today, and I'm feeling quite exuberant tonight, having just come home from donation 115 at the blood bank. I feel fantastic. I love looking behind as I get up out of that chair and seeing that golden bag of liquid behind that I've left that I know will go to someone. You know, within 48 hours it will have gone to someone to help save their life, and it makes me feel $1 million. And the blood bank, the staff are just so wonderful. They just greet you with smiles, and oh, I feel fantastic. I love the fortnightly rhythm I have going to the blood bank and with Mum looking after my Billy, and it all works out really well. So I'm going well. Thank you. Bye for now.